Around us here in Hard Bargain, obviously the African-American tension with a dominant white culture versus a minority black culture, that's there. And because we're a central southern city, we just have the residue of that 400 years of slavery that continued to breed that distrust. I think an intentional pushing out those that are not from a certain dominant cultured life. I think that is who the meek are, the people who are overlooked and forgotten.
That was a conversation from the film with my friend Scott Rowley, who tirelessly works for racial reconciliation right here in the Nashville area. On this episode, we're looking at Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth.
So as we turn to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, verse 5, we have these words of Jesus recorded: "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." The Message translates that you're blessed when you're content with just who you are, no more, no less. That's the moment you find yourselves proud owners of everything that can't be bought.
So what is meek? You know, I kind of grew up just thinking that it was like being humble and gentle, and you know, you wouldn't argue with someone if they pushed in front of you in a queue or a line, you know, and really seeing meekness as a virtue, you know. But I think one thing that stood out to me, even in the scripture, you know, Jesus says, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." And we know for a fact that the meek don't inherit anything. You know, the powerful do. You know, the bullies do. The ones who have the biggest guns and the loudest voice and the most of everything and the number ones on the charts or the Amazon bestsellers, whatever. They have the power, not the ones underneath. And so there's something else going on here, and it really could potentially be the most political thing that is, or one of the most political things in the New Testament. You know, because you're standing on that hillside with a group of people who are in the presence of Roman centurions probably, and Jesus is saying, the meek shall inherit the earth, not the powerful. And again, Jesus kind of references one of the Psalms, I think it's Psalm 37, you know, and so people would just be thinking about, you know, what God has said about their story and how he hears the cry of the oppressed. And so I spent some time with Rabbi Joseph, and we were talking over the length of about 3 days. I mean, we're talking about other things too, but he was fascinated with why I was interested in the meek so much. And I was thinking, well, I didn't know how to talk about the meek at first. Like I said, I thought it was about the humble or the gentle. I thought it was a virtue. But then knowing that the Beatitudes are announcements of God's blessing in the upside down of life, and where it just looks like things aren't working out, you know, it's like, okay, so, you know, what could this look like? And we ended up with this phrase: the meek are those whose presence is ignored. And so it really is about the powerful and the powerless. And sometimes it's enforced meekness, like, for instance, you know, if you're overrun by a super PAC or something and they take your land, as in the case of the Jewish people 2,000 years ago, or sometimes you choose not to react with power. So 2 examples of that would be Jesus himself. You know, he didn't incite violence or a riot or an uprising against the Romans, and it eventually took him to the cross. You know, he decided that it was more important to love God and love people and love your neighbor as yourself than it was to rise up with the sword, you know, and it killed him. And then another example of that would be Martin Luther King, who also could have incited riot and mob violence to fight the cause of racial injustice, and yet he insisted on peaceful protest. And again, his life was taken. And so people who are meek, you know, it doesn't look like they're inheriting anything, and they often lose their lives.
Wow, that's so true, Stu. And as you're talking about the powerless, I think the word came to my mind is invisibility. There are people who are like, they're not seen, they're invisible, and they're vulnerable, right? You're out of sight, you're forgotten, and you can be easily exploited. And man, that's nothing any of us want to aspire to, right? Like we
Right.
don't wake up in the morning and say, I want to be vulnerable to other people. But when you are powerless, there's an overwhelming sense of vulnerability that goes with that, I think.
Yeah, so this kind of leads to the question then, so who are the meek in our neighborhoods? You know, who are the meek around us? And you can ask that question another way, like whose presence do I ignore? Or who am I not seeing? Who's invisible to me in my neighborhoods? And so the reason that I got to know Scott Rowley, who was at the beginning of this episode, was because as a Englishman, a white Englishman, no less, coming to America and living in the South here, I didn't have any friends who perhaps are seen as the other. And so I went outside of my own comfort zone or whatever, and just for my own health and benefit started to make some friends. And so I went and visited First Missionary Baptist Church on Natchez Street, and Karen and I were two of about 3 or 4 white people in that church that day. And it was beautiful. You know, we were welcomed so beautifully by this community, but it's in an area that is so poor. And it struck me that in Franklin here in Tennessee, which is a wealthy town, you know, you've got sort of $1 million mansions on this particular road. And at the end of their garden is the projects where there's like, you know, community housing and people are living in poverty. So I wanted to know about the African-American community here and some of those neighborhoods like Hard Bargain, which is where Scott works in helping people rebuild their homes to stop the kind of gentrification of that area. Yeah, so for me, you know, I had the African-American conversation, spoke to a lot of people here, and it got me thinking about other folks whose presence I ignore, or perhaps who I don't even want to be friends with, or that I see as the other, you know. So I reached out to the Islamic Center of Nashville, and because I wanted to have a conversation with a religious Muslim to say, so what's it like? Like, did you come here as a refugee? Like, what was your story here? And to get here, and then what's it like living in the South here, in the Bible Belt, post 9/11, and in the age of ISIS? You know, my interest in their story wasn't trying to convert them, but I just wanted to listen to where they're at, you know, and so what is life like to you? You know, and so it could be quite surprising watching the film and doing the study and meeting these people and saying, well, that's not what I thought Meek was, you know. But we're definitely coming from it from the angle of who is it who we see as the other, whose presence is ignored. And perhaps these people were doctors or lawyers in their original countries, and then when they come here, they're washing dishes.
Wow. I hear you saying how you intentionally chose to look for those who would be the invisible ones, right? Like I would assume you adjusted your schedule and you maybe drove to a different part of town.
Totally.
And you sought people out for conversation, maybe not knowing how they would respond. But did you find you were welcomed into those conversations as you approached that?
Yeah, 100%. In fact, I reached out to the Islamic Center of Nashville, like I said, and I had a response back in my inbox within 5 minutes.
Wow.
Because I think, you know, most people, if you're seen as a minority or, dare I say, a threat or something, or people just don't understand you, then what I've discovered is that folks are desperate to connect and engage. We have this phrase that I learned from Rabbi Joseph that engagement is greater than tolerance. Like what we need is engagement. We need discussion. We need like, how can I help you? Or, you know, looking for mutual common ground, stuff like that, rather than just putting up with someone, you know, rather than just tolerating someone. You know, we might believe different things, but that isn't the connecting point. The connecting point is that we are all bearers of the image of God. That is the connection point between humanity.
That's beautiful. Beautiful. And to listen to the invitation to live that way. I think that's part of this beatitude, right? Is
Right.
the invitation from Christ to live that way.
Yes. And you can kind of begin to see the link between the Beatitudes, and the question we asked at the beginning about what does it mean to listen. Listening to someone's story is so important to understand where people are coming from. But even if you don't understand, it's the act of making someone feel heard, and our presence can do that. And in being present, then we are offering the presence of God in that moment.
That's so good. And I think we have to combat our fear in that situation. And a friend of mine says, the degree to which you have fear in your life is equal to the degree that you do not know you're loved. So we have these areas in our lives where we don't really believe that God loves us. And we have fear and we react out of fear. And that just propels more fear as we engage with other people, who's different than us. When we relate to them based on fear, it just results in more fear and more retaliation. And in the midst of that, perfect love is showing up and saying, there's a better way. I'm inviting you to live in this better way. I think whatever we birth in fear, we've got to sustain with fear. Right? Otherwise, what we birth in love can be sustained by love.
That's really good. That's really good. So, when you look into the project and you watch the film and things like that, I've definitely chosen things that are perhaps hot topics in terms of race, religion, refugees. I had the absolute privilege of going into a home in Nashville where this refugee family had just come from Syria 2 months previous. And, there was a language barrier. I didn't speak Arabic. They didn't speak English. Their son is a musician, and we played music together in their house. And then I invited him to come and play on a song that I'd written with Audrey Assad. And it's really a song for refugees called "I Will Be Your Home" on the project. And we just had that whole thing is a beautiful experience. And Audrey is such an amazing artist and songwriter and a brilliant communicator. So can't wait for you all to see the film and hear what she had to say about that. But, it's definitely an act of going beyond yourself. And like fear isn't at the forefront of your mind. Friendship is.
That's good.
But what I would say to add to that is that, so like I said, we kind of picked some hot topics in terms of our culture right now. But the meek in your neighborhood, what about the elderly? What about the old lady that lives on her own down the road? Like, is her presence ignored? What about at your church? You might have some disabled people or less abled people and physically or mentally handicapped folks, or the deaf and the blind. Like, are these people in your midst, but you don't really take any notice of them? Because it does take an investment of time to go and offer your presence. What about prisoners? Are they people whose presence we ignore? So the meek are around us in this context. And I'm not saying this is the only way to look at things, but this is what came alive for me as we were starting to dive into the themes in the Beatitudes and the theme of the meek shall inherit the earth, and what does power and powerlessness, what does presence and absence look like, you know?
That's beautiful. And it is the Jesus way. We read in the scriptures, Jesus saying, "Come learn of me, for I'm meek and humble of heart." And so we have to hit pause and say, wow, the God in flesh is describing himself as meek. He's one who's overlooked, and he's one who was invisible to a lot of the culture in which he lived. And it forces us then to have the conversation of what is true power. I think we live in an age where we see power abused all the time, and we see power used to exploit people, and we believe that power corrupts. But from a Christian frame of reference, we have to look at the one who has all power. And what does he do with his all power? He creates and he gives life to seemingly superfluous creation. God didn't need creation to be complete, but out of the overflow of his love and in the fullness of his power, he creates. And then we see the next step, he humbles himself to redeem. So he uses his power to save. So the one who has all power shows us what true power should look like. It's self-giving and other-centered. And so the Jesus way is inviting us to live that way as well, to be self-giving and other-centered, especially to those who are invisible around us.
So good. So that's really the invitation here. You know, when I think about power and just being honest, you know, there have been moments in the past where I have definitely used my status or my visibility to overpower someone without really like thinking about it in those terms, but to kind of stay a step ahead or to make sure that I'm safe and secure or something like that, you know. And so when I look at this idea of meekness, you know, and power, I've realized that I'm not separated from the need to repent of some of that stuff, you know?
Yeah, that's so good. And what you're hitting on reminds me of Andy Crouch when he has this brilliant little book called Playing God, and he talks about redeeming the gift of power, but how power can easily kind of morph into this privilege. Many times we're not even aware that we're living from that place of privilege. And he shares a story of being in India, actually, and he's at the back of the line waiting to get on an airplane, and the ticket taker stops what's going on, comes to the back of the line, points at him, "You, come with me," brings him to the front of the line, checks him in, sends him on the plane. Like he said, he bypassed maybe 50 people who were waiting in line before him. He was moved to the front of the line and sent on the plane simply because he was a white American. And he said in that moment, he felt so ashamed. He's like, I didn't ask for this. I don't want this. And then he kind of just felt that conviction in his heart of how many times have you been moved to the front of the line, Andy, and you didn't even realize it? Like throughout your life, how many times have you just been given privilege and you weren't even aware of it because you're used to it? So there's that danger when power turns into privilege and we use it on ourselves and we're not even aware that we're using it on ourselves. And then there's that invitation of Jesus to utilize the power that we do have to work for the common good.
Heaven is around us, heaven is all around. Heaven is around us, heaven is all around. Here's to the weak, here's to the scared. Happy are the meek, for your country is theirs. For all of us, the King, so come.
What are some potential ways that we could use the power that we have to serve those who are meek, to serve those who are unseen in our communities?
Yeah, my friend Charles Robinson has some good thoughts on this. Here's a clip from a conversation we had in the film.
One of the challenges we have is being able to see life from somebody else's perspective. So based on my life experiences as a native man, growing up in Texas and Oklahoma and living in Tennessee and the travels I've done, I've got all these different colored lenses I put on my glasses. The challenge is, can I take off my glasses and put on yours and see life from your perspective? And when we can do that, then we have a greater heart of acceptance for things that are different than what we know of as our normal.
Wow, that's the invitation right there, isn't it? To first be made aware of the fact that we do have glasses on. We do have a filter through which we're seeing the world. And I think we have to invite the Lord and other people to help us realize that in the first place, and then to intentionally seek to engage with others. And I think it's something you say in the film, that the active engagement means that we put a human face onto people. They're no longer just those people over there, the others. We see them as an actual human being, as you said, an image bearer made in the image of God.
Yes, that's really good. And I love the idea that Charles said about putting on someone else's lenses, and seeing life from their perspective. And of course, that's impossible in some situations, but, to get alongside someone and to do what we said in the first episode, which is to listen to their stories and listen where they're coming from. That's part of putting the lens on, We don't have to travel the world to experience this.
Right.
We can do this in our town, Yeah, and if we become aware of those whose presence is ignored around us in our neighborhoods, I think that our lives get changed forever.
Yeah, that's right. In that invitation, there's a call to be self-giving and not self-serving, a call to live in acceptance of others instead of judgment.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a call to live in a place where we celebrate our diversity instead of living from a place of competition. And I think underlying all those is that idea of fear again. If we're living from a place of fear, we can't be self-giving, we can't be accepting, and we can't celebrate the other. But when we live from a place of love, knowing the love of God poured out for us in Christ Jesus, we can be self-giving, we can live accepting others, and we can celebrate those who are different than us.
That's so true. I think one of the dangers of talking like this just brings about this kind of feeling like, well, I'm not doing that. I'm not going outside of myself and meeting these people and what have you. And we can end up sort of beating ourselves up. And that's not the point of the Beatitudes, and it's not the point of this podcast or this project. The idea is that it's all invitation. And so sometimes the blessing is in the desire to be different.
Yeah.
It's in the desire itself to change. We'll talk about that in Hunger and Thirst. But so don't feel like we're telling you that you have to do exactly the same thing as we're doing. It's like we all have our own different path. And the meek around you, those whose presence is ignored around you, are going to be different. This idea and concept of the meek and noticing people or including people kind of goes way back in the Jewish story. As far back as Deuteronomy 29, Rabbi Joseph was telling me about this. When Moses gathers the people, he gathers all the people. And it says this in Deuteronomy 29, it says, your children and your wives and the foreigners living in your camps who chop your wood and carry your water. So it's like these are the people who we probably wouldn't take much notice of, right? Mm-hmm. In that kind of society, wives, children, the people that are working for us, foreigners in our land that are like our servants. And but Moses is saying, no, we include everyone in this covenant.
That's beautiful. Yeah, it's so good. And of course, that's the invitation to live that way because that's the way God is
right
with us.
Yeah.
Right. I think some of the beauty of this invitation is it's really an invitation to think with God, to see the world through a new set of lenses. And so we just want to invite you today or this week to spend some time thinking with God about your life. Ask yourself, have there been times or circumstances where you felt like you've had your power taken away from you? And what did you feel when you felt powerless? And conversely, ask yourself, have there been times where you used your power or influence or privilege over somebody else? And what did that feel like? And then think about the other in your world, who the other is right now, who's the invisible person in your world right now. And maybe make a plan of action to go to see them, to engage with them, to strike up a conversation that might even grow into a friendship, but some way that you can walk out being love incarnate to your community.
So good.